2019, a military government took over Sudan following a successful coup d'etat against then-President Omar al-Bashir, who had been in power for 30 years. Al-Bashir's latter years were plagued by popular demonstrations against rising costs of living and pretty abysmal living standards, and the government lashed out against protesters violently, before then dissolving local government leaders and their offices, replacing them with hand-picked military and intelligence officers. After he responded violently to yet another even bigger protest, the military launched their coup, and the protesters pivoted to targeting them, demanding a civilian-run democracy. Just 2 months later, after unsuccessful negotiations between the new military government and the folks demanding they step aside to allow a civilian government to take charge, the military leaders massacred a bunch of civilians who hosted a sit-in protest. Protesters shifted to a period of sustained civil disobedience and a general strike, and the government agreed to hold elections in 2022, 3 years later, and said that they would investigate the massacre their soldiers committed against those protesters. They also established a joint civilian-military unity government that would run things until the new civilian government was eventually formed. In late 2021, though, the Sudanese military launched another coup against the unity government, and that council was dissolved. A state of emergency was declared, and all the important people who were helping the country segue back into a democracy were arrested. A new military-only junta was formed, incorporating the two main military groups that were running things at that point. In 2023, 2 years later, those two military bodies that were working together to run Sudan via this military junta, the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group that was made into a sort of official part of the country's military, while still remaining separate from it, and the official Sudanese army, both started aggressively recruiting soldiers and taunting each other with aggressive military maneuvers. On April 15th of that year, they then started firing on each other. This conflict stemmed from the Sudanese military demanding that the RSF dissolve itself, all their people integrating into the country's main military apparatus. But some kind of standoff seemed to be a long time coming, as the RSF started its recruiting efforts earlier that year and built up its military resources in the capital as early as February. But as I mentioned, this tinderbox erupted into a shooting war in April, beginning in the capital of Khartoum, before spreading fast to other major cities. So what eventually became a Sudanese civil war, which at this point has been ongoing for nearly 2.5 years, began in April of 2023, was long simmering before that, is between two heavily armed military groups that ran the country together for a few years, and which both claim to be the rightful leaders or owners of the country, and they're fighting each other in heavily populated areas. This war was also kicked off and is now sustained in part by ethnic conflicts between the main belligerents, which includes the aforementioned Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces, but also the Sudan Liberation Movement, which governs a fairly remote and self-sufficient mountainous area in the southern part of the country, and the al-Hilu movement, which supports the RSF's efforts in the region but remains separate. What I'd like to talk about today is what is happening on the ground in Sudan in the third year of this conflict, and at a moment when the world's attention seems to have refocused elsewhere. Major governments that would have previously attempted to stop the civil war have more or less given up on doing so, and the Sudanese civilians who have been pulled into this conflict or who have been forced to flee their homes as a consequence of this war have been left without food, shelter, or any good guys to cheer for. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. Sudan has been plagued by coups since it gained independence from the UK and Egypt in 1956. it has seen 20 coup attempts, 7 of them successful, including that most recent one in 2019 since its independence. This region also has a recent history of genocide, perhaps most notably in the western Darfur region, where an estimated 250,000 people from a trio of ethnic groups were killed between 2003 and 2005 alone, and something like 2.7 million people were displaced, forced to flee the systematic killings, the strategically applied sexual violence, and the other abuses by the Sudanese military and the local rebel Janjaweed militias, which were often armed by the government and tasked with weeding out alleged rebel sympathizers in the region. This new civil war is on a completely different scale, though. As of April of 2025, 2 years into the conflict, it's estimated that about 12.5 million people have been displaced, forced from their homes due to everything being burned down or bombed, due to threats from local military groups, killing and assaulting and forcibly recruiting civilians to their cause, and due to a lack of resources, the food and water and shelter, all grabbed by these military forces and denied to those who are just trying to live their lives. And that's true of the locally sourced stuff, but also humanitarian aid that makes it into the country. It is grabbed by the people with guns, and the people without guns are often left with nothing. More than 3.3 million Sudanese people are estimated to have fled the country entirely, and recent figures show that around 25 million people in Sudan are facing extreme levels of hunger, on the verge of starving to death, including about 5 million children and their mothers, who are essentially wasting away. There are reports of people eating leaves and charcoal just to get something in their stomachs, and photo evidence of these unmoving crowds of skeletal people who are desperate to get anything at all, any kind of nutrition, any clean water, still sometimes make it out of the country, though less and less, as it's become more difficult for reporters to make it into and out of the area safely, and the internet and other communication services, where they are still available, are often shut down or not available to civilians. Aid agencies have said that this civil war has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and even the US government, which especially right now has been very hesitant to say anything about foreign conflicts, has made it pretty clear that they consider this to be a genocide. There are conscious, intentional, obviously planned efforts to systematically wipe out different ethnic groups and to cleanse areas of hated political and religious rivals. But this genocide is being carried out at the exact moment that many of the world's major wealthy and powerful governments, which historically would have tried to step in and remedy the situation in some way, often ham-handedly, sometimes by supporting one side or the other to try to gain influence in the region, but almost always by also airdropping food and medical supplies and other resources into the area to try to help civilians. These governments are mostly absent. They are pulling back from these sorts of efforts globally right now. Some analysts and regional experts have suggested that this points toward a new normal in the global geopolitical playing field, the so-called liberal world order that helped organize things that established rules and norms from the end of World War II onward, and which incentivized everyone playing nice with each other, most of the time at least, not invading each other, not committing genocide, and focusing on trade over war. That system is falling apart. The United States in particular, having decided to stop funding things, to stop participating, deciding to antagonize the allies that helped it maintain this state of affairs, and to basically drop anything that seems too much like a responsibility to people who don't live in the United States. And a lot of other governments are either scrambling to figure out what that means for them, or are deciding that they can afford to do the same thing now. China, for instance, while stepping in to fill some of those voids left by the US strategically, has also pulled back on a lot of its humanitarian efforts because it no longer needs to invest as much in such things to compete with the United States, which no longer seems to be competing in that space at all, with rare exceptions. Conflicts in Africa, also with rare exceptions, also just tend to get a lot less attention and resources than conflicts that take place elsewhere. And there are all sorts of theories as to why this might be the case, from simple overt racism to the idea that areas with more economic potential, with more infrastructure already developed and trade goods and such, are more valuable as allies or supplicants. So wealthy nations with the ability to do something will tend to focus their resources on areas that are more strategically vital or already wealth generating, so as to recoup their investment. Whatever the specifics and rationales, though, Sudan has long been conflict prone, but this civil war seems to be locking the area into a state of total war, where nothing is off the table, and terror against civilians, and to a certain degree, the strategic desire to wipe out one's enemies completely, salting the earth, killing all of the civilians, all of the women, all of the children, all of the unarmed people, so that these groups can never threaten your force's dominance ever again, is becoming fundamental to everyone's military strategy. And that state of total war, in addition to just being horrific all by itself, also threatens to roil the rest of this part of the world, including the far more globally integrated and thus well-supported and funded Horn of Africa region, which is strategically vital for many nations due to its adjacency to the Middle East and to several vital ports, and the Sahel, which is a strip of land that stretches across the upper portion of the African continent, just south of the Sahara Desert, and which in modern history has been especially prone to military coups and periods of violence, at times verging on genocide, and which in recent decades has seen a whole lot of democratic governments toppled and replaced by military juntas that have done their best to completely disempower all future opposition, at times by committing what looks a lot like mini genocides. This conflict all by itself, then, is already one of the worst humanitarian situations the world has ever seen, but the confluence of international distraction, much of our attention and the majority of international resources focused on the also horrible situations in Gaza and Ukraine, and the specter of great power competitions that might arise as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, or of China maybe deciding to invade Taiwan at some point, alongside the pullback from humanitarian funding and the seeming distaste previously internationally involved entities like the US and China now seem to have when it comes to playing peacemaker or attempted peacemaker in these sorts of conflicts, all seem to make it more likely that this conflict, this civil war, and others like it, will continue to play out, and may even reach a scale that permanently scars Sudan and its people, and which could even cascade into a series of regional conflicts, some interconnected, but some merely inspired by the brazenness that some of these forces can clearly see happening across the border, and that they can clearly see is resulting in no serious consequences for those committing these sorts of atrocities in the pursuit of more power and control for their group and their allies. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age by Ada Palmer. Ada Palmer is an amazing author, does a lot of wonderful writing online as well, and this book is very interesting because it challenges the concept of the Renaissance as being this golden age of artistic merit and discovery, and I think this portion of the publisher-provided synopsis does a particularly good job of describing her approach to talking about the Renaissance. Quote, "Troubled by centuries of conflict, she argues, Europe looked to a long-lost Roman Empire, even its education practices, to save them from unending war. Later historians met their own political challenges with a similarly nostalgic vision, only now they looked to the Renaissance and told a partial story. To right this wrong, Palmer offers 15 provocative portraits of Renaissance men and women, some famous, some obscure, whose lives reveal a far more diverse, fragile, and wild Renaissance than its glowing reputation suggests." Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.